Their arrangement was sensible. He needed a wife to help manage his growing ranch. She needed escape from a dwindling future in Philadelphia. Neither had mentioned love, another point in her favor. The locomotive hissed to a stop, belching steam across the platform. Passengers began descending, city folk mostly, with their fine clothes and uncertain expressions as they faced the raw reality of Wyoming Territory. Yates searched the faces, looking for the woman who matched the small daguerreotype he'd received, dark-haired, composed, with intelligent eyes. Instead, his attention caught on a young woman sitting alone on a bench at the far end of the platform, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Her honey-blonde hair, coming loose from its pins, caught the afternoon sunlight. Her blue traveling dress, though quality fabric, was rumpled from the journey. She couldn't have been more than 22. Something twisted in Yates' chest, not quite pity, not quite concern, but a pull he couldn't ignore. He hesitated, then walked toward her, hat in hand. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly. "Are you waiting for someone?" She looked up, startled, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and striking green eyes. "Mr. Landry," she whispered, recognition and fresh panic crossing her face. Yates froze. "Miss Garland." She nodded, then burst into fresh tears. "I'm so sorry," she managed between sobs. I'm not what you ordered." The platform had nearly emptied now, leaving them in awkward isolation as the train departed with a screech of metal and another blast of its whistle. Yates stood rooted, staring at this blonde stranger who bore no resemblance to the dark-haired, practical woman from the daguerreotype. "There's been some kind of mistake," he said finally, his voice tight. She shook her head, fishing a handkerchief from her reticule. "No mistake, Mr. Landry. I'm Genevieve Garland. I wrote those letters, but the photograph—" She drew a shuddering breath. "It wasn't me, it was my friend Elainer. I was afraid if I sent my real likeness, you wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" Yates asked, a cold feeling spreading through him. "Choose me," she finished simply. "I thought once we'd corresponded, once you knew my mind, my heart, it wouldn't matter what I looked like. But then the train was approaching, and I realized what I'd done, and how angry you'd be, and you thought I'd send you back," Yates finished for her, something shifting painfully in his chest. Her deception stung, but the fear behind it troubled him more. Genevieve nodded miserably. "I understand if that's what you wish to do. I've saved enough for a return ticket. I never meant to deceive you, Philadelphia had nothing left for me after my father died, and your letters were so kind, so thoughtful." Yates ran a hand through his hair, staring at this woman who had written those intelligent, warm letters that had kept him company through the long winter nights. "Stand up," he said quietly. She obeyed, gathering her small valise and rising to face him. She was tall, nearly reaching his shoulder, with a straight back and steady hands despite her tears. Up close he could see faint freckles across her nose and the determined set of her chin beneath the vulnerability. "Why did you think I wouldn't choose you?" he asked bluntly, her cheeks flushed. "I'm not conventional. Not in looks, not in thoughts. Elainer is beautiful in the way men expect. She gestured vaguely at herself, too tall, too outspoken. My father's friends said I'd never find a husband in Philadelphia because I spoke my mind too freely and had too many opinions about books and politics." Yates studied her face. There was honesty there now and a quiet dignity beneath the embarrassment. "Your letters mentioned helping your father with his accounting. Was that true?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Everything in the letters was true, my education, my skills with figures, my willingness to work. Only the photograph was false." Something was unsettling the neat, practical plans Yates had made. This woman had deceived him, yes, but not about anything that truly mattered for survival on the frontier. If anything, her fear revealed a vulnerability that made her more human than the composed, perfect bride he'd imagined. "I have a wagon outside," he said finally. "We can discuss this further over dinner at the hotel. I'll pay for your room tonight, and if you still wish to return east tomorrow, I'll purchase your ticket." Relief and uncertainty crossed her face. "You're very kind, Mr. Landry." "Not kind," he corrected. "Practical, night's coming, and decisions shouldn't be made in haste." As he loaded her trunk into his wagon, Yates caught himself watching the graceful way she climbed onto the bench, how she straightened her skirts with dignity despite her situation. Something about her struck him as utterly genuine now that the deception was exposed, more genuine, perhaps, than the perfect bride he'd constructed in his imagination. "How old are you, Miss Garland?" he asked as he guided the horses toward town. 22 last month," she answered. "And you, Mr. Landry?" 26 in December, he glanced sideways at her. My ranch is 3 miles outside town. It's not much yet. A cabin, a barn, some good grazing land. I've got 60 head of cattle now, looking to double that by next year. She nodded. Your letters described it. You mentioned building a larger house eventually. That was the plan, he agreed, surprised she remembered that detail. They fell into silence as the wagon rolled into Cottonwood Springs, a growing town of wooden buildings with false fronts, a church steeple, and the inevitable saloon. Yates noticed Genevieve taking everything in with keen interest rather than dismay, another point in her favor. Many Eastern women arrived with expectations of comforts the frontier couldn't provide. At the hotel, a two-story affair that passed for luxury in Wyoming Territory, Yates secured a room for Miss Garland and arranged for dinner in the small dining room. They sat across from each other at a corner table, the awkwardness between them slightly eased by the practical tasks of ordering and being served. Why accounting? Yates asked after their food arrived. Unusual occupation for a woman. Genevieve's expression brightened slightly. My father was an accountant for several businesses. When my mother died, I was 12, and he had no one to leave me with during working hours. He taught me his trade rather than send me to relatives. She smiled faintly. I discovered I had an aptitude for mathematics and organization. After I finished school, I assisted him formally. And after he died, her smile faded. His clients preferred male accountants. The only position offered was as a filing clerk at half the salary, despite having done the work for years. She straightened. I chose to seek other options. Like becoming a mail-order bride, Yates supplied. Yes, she met his eyes directly. I wanted a partnership, Mr. Landry. Your letters suggested you wanted the same, someone to build a life with, not merely a housekeeper or companionship. He crept up Yates' neck. I meant what I wrote. As did I, she hesitated, except about my appearance. The waiter brought coffee, giving Yates a moment to gather his thoughts. The woman across from him was nothing like he'd expected, yet everything her letters had promised. The deception troubled him, but he understood fear. The frontier taught that lesson daily. I need to be direct, Miss Garland, he said finally. I can't offer romance or flowery sentiments. The territory demands too much for such luxuries. What I can offer is honesty, hard work, and respect. I need a partner who understands that building something here requires sacrifice and practical thinking. I understand sacrifice, Mr. Landry, she said quietly, and practical thinking has been my companion since childhood. I don't expect romance, only the chance to build something meaningful and be valued for my contributions. Their eyes held across the table, and Yates felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits beneath their differences. Neither believed in frontier fairy tales, both sought something solid instead. Tomorrow, he said, I'll show you the ranch. You should see what you're considering before making your decision. And you should be certain I'm who you want, despite my deception, she countered. Yates nodded. A day to decide, then, for both of us. That night, alone in his room at the boarding house where he stayed during town visits, Yates found himself unable to sleep. Miss Garland's deception still rankled, but her honesty afterward and the intelligence in her green eyes kept returning to his thoughts. Her letters had spoken of building a partnership, not unlike the business arrangements that helped settlers survive the territory's harsh demands. Perhaps, he thought, as dawn broke, practicality could take different forms. The next morning, Yates collected Genevieve after breakfast, his wagon loaded with supplies for the ranch. She appeared wearing a simpler dress of brown cotton, her honey-blonde hair practically braided, and sturdy boots visible beneath her hem, prepared for reality, not pretense. You look, he began, then faltered, unused to complimenting women. Practical, she supplied with a faint smile. Suited to the territory, he finished, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. The ride to his ranch took them through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush, the distant mountains blue against the horizon. Yates found himself pointing out landmarks, explaining which grazing areas were best in different seasons, how the creek running through his property never dried even in August. It's beautiful, Genevieve said softly as they crested a hill overlooking his land. Below them lay Yates' cabin and barn, a corral with several horses, and beyond, cattle grazing on the spring grass. Wilder than I imagined, but beautiful. It's hard country, Yates warned. Winter's brutal, summer brings drought, Nearest neighbor is 4 miles away. Town's fine for supplies but hardly civilization by Eastern standards. She turned to him, sunlight catching in her hair. Mr. Landry, are you trying to frighten me away or test my resolve? The directness of her question startled a laugh from him, his first in her presence. Both, maybe. The territory breaks people who come with false expectations. Then give me truth instead, she challenged. Show me what my life would be if I stayed. I did. For the remainder of the day, Yates showed Genevieve every aspect of ranch life, from the cramped but solid cabin with its stone fireplace and rough furniture, to the vegetable garden struggling in the alkaline soil, to the barn where he demonstrated the morning milking. She followed, asking practical questions, occasionally rolling up her sleeves to try tasks herself. By late afternoon, they sat on the cabin's small porch, drinking coffee and watching the lengthening shadows. Yates found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes as she surveyed his land that could be hers too, if they both chose it. My father died from influenza when I was 17, he said abruptly. Mother followed before spring. I built this place from nothing but their wagon and tools. Everything you see I created with these hands. Genevieve turned to him. You must be very proud. Not proud, determined, he met her eyes. The territory doesn't care about pride. Only survival. Is that all you want, Mr. Landry, to survive? There was genuine curiosity in her voice, not judgment. The question unsettled him. Surviving is enough. Expecting more invites disappointment. Perhaps, she said thoughtfully, or perhaps surviving alone is merely existing, while building a life with someone else might be truly living. Her words struck uncomfortably close to thoughts Yates had buried beneath practicality and hard work. Before he could respond, hoofbeats sounded from the approach to the cabin. Yates stood, instantly alert. A rider approached, and Yates recognized Frank Wilson, owner of the neighboring ranch. Afternoon, Landry, Wilson called, tipping his hat to Genevieve. Ma'am, sorry to interrupt, but there's trouble brewing. Cattle rustlers hit the Petersons' place last night. Took 20 head and shot their foreman when he tried to stop them. Yates tensed. Rustlers meant danger for every rancher in the area. Peterson all right. Shaken, we're gathering men to track the thieves before they get those cattle across the territorial line. Need every gun we can muster. Yates glanced at Genevieve, whose face had paled slightly but remained composed. When are you riding out? Dawn tomorrow, meeting at Peterson's place. Wilson nodded to Genevieve. Begging your pardon, ma'am, didn't mean to bring trouble to your doorstep. Miss Garland understands the territory's challenges, Yates said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. After Wilson departed, a heavy silence fell. Yates turned to Genevieve. This is the reality of frontier life. Danger doesn't announce itself politely or wait for convenient timing. I understand, she said quietly. Will you go with them tomorrow? I have to. Every rancher must defend the others or none of us survive. He hesitated. I'll take you back to town tonight. You can stay at the hotel until this is resolved, then decide whether to stay or return east. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. I think I've already decided, Mr. Landry. His heart sank unexpectedly. I understand the danger. Has nothing to do with my decision, she interrupted. I didn't come west expecting safety. I came seeking purpose and partnership. She met his eyes steadily. If you'll still have me, despite my deception, I choose to stay. Yates stared at her, this woman who had surprised him at every turn. Why? Because your letters showed a man of integrity and determination. Because this land, though harsh, has a beauty that speaks to something in me, and because I believe we could build something meaningful here together. Something long dormant stirred in Yates' chest, not love, not yet, but possibility. It won't be easy. Few worthwhile things are, she countered. I don't need easy, Mr. Landry, I need purpose. That evening, Yates took Genevieve back to town, arranging for her to stay at the boarding house under the watchful eye of Mrs. Hollister, the respectable widow who ran it. They agreed that upon his return, if both still wished it, they would speak to the preacher about a simple ceremony. Be careful, Genevieve said as he prepared to leave her at the boarding house door. I'd prefer not to become a widow before becoming a wife. Her practical concern, stated without sentimentality, struck Yates as perfectly fitted to their arrangement. I'll return, he promised simply. Dawn found Yates riding with 15 other men, following the rustlers' trail south toward the territorial border. The next 3 days blurred into a grueling chase across unforgiving country, sleeping briefly in bedrolls, eating jerky from saddlebags, pushing both horses and men to their limits. On the 4th day, they caught the rustlers making camp in a narrow valley. The ensuing gunfight was brief but violent. When it ended, 2 rustlers lay dead, 3 were captured, and the stolen cattle were secured. One of the ranchers took a bullet in the shoulder. Yates himself suffered a deep graze across his ribs that burned like fire but wasn't life-threatening. They returned to Cottonwood Springs a week after they'd departed, driving the recovered cattle ahead of them, the captured rustlers bound on their horses. A crowd gathered as they rode into town, including Genevieve, who stood on the boarding house porch, shading her eyes against the setting sun. Yates dismounted stiffly, aware of the dried blood staining his shirt and the week's worth of beard darkening his jaw. Genevieve descended the steps and approached him, her face carefully neutral as she assessed his condition. "You're injured," she stated, eyes fixing on his bloodied side. "It's shallow," he assured her. "Needs cleaning is all." She nodded once, then surprised him by taking the reins of his horse. "Mrs. Hollister has prepared hot water and food. The doctor can see to your wound there." Yates found himself following her lead, too exhausted to argue. At the boarding house, Mrs. Hollister directed him to a back room where a basin of steaming water, clean towels, and a simple meal awaited. To his surprise, after the older woman departed, Genevieve remained. "I can tend that wound," she said matter-of-factly. "I assisted when my father fell ill, unless you prefer the doctor." Yates hesitated, then nodded. "Save the doctor for Wilson. His shoulder needs professional attention." Genevieve worked efficiently, helping him remove his ruined shirt, cleaning the long furrow across his ribs with gentle but thorough movements. Her touch was clinical, respectful of his dignity while tending his injury. Neither spoke until she began wrapping a clean bandage around his torso. "I was concerned," she said finally, her voice carefully modulated. "When days passed with no word." Yates looked down at her bent head, at the careful way she secured the bandage. "Frontier communication has room for improvement," he said dryly. She glanced up, and he was surprised to see a flash of humor in her eyes. "Indeed, perhaps that should be my first project as Mrs. Landry, improving territorial communications." The casual reference to their arrangement, to her staying, loosened something in Yates' chest. "You're still certain, then?" Her hands stilled on the bandage. "I am." "Are you?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave to all major decisions. This woman had deceived him once, yes, but since then she had shown only honesty, practicality, and a quiet strength that the frontier demanded. The letters that had drawn him to her had been genuine, even if the photograph wasn't. "I am," he said finally. "If you'll accept that I'm not a man given to romantic displays, I can promise respect, partnership, and protection. The rest may grow with time," she finished for him, "or it may not. Either way, we'll build something worthwhile." 2 days later, they stood before Reverend Thomas in the small wooden church at the edge of town. Yates wore his one good suit, freshly brushed. Genevieve wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. Mrs. Hollister and several ranchers who'd ridden with Yates against the rustlers served as witnesses. The ceremony was brief, the words ancient and binding. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Yates hesitated only a moment before leaning down to place a chaste kiss on Genevieve's lips, their first. Her cheeks flushed pink, but her eyes, meeting his, were steady and clear. As they drove back to the ranch, their ranch now, Genevieve broke the contemplative silence. "I have a confession, Mr. Landry." Yates raised an eyebrow. "Another one." She smiled, the expression transforming her face with unexpected warmth. "I brought books, quite a few of them. They're in my trunk." "Books," he repeated. "Yes, history, mathematics, some literature, and seed catalogs." She glanced sideways at him. "I thought we might expand the garden. I've been researching which vegetables thrive in alkaline soil." Yates found himself smiling, a rusty expression he'd nearly forgotten. "Practical thinking, Mrs. Landry." "I thought you'd approve," she said, the formality between them easing slightly. That night, after a simple meal in what was now their home, they faced the awkwardness of their new arrangement. Yates had built the cabin with a future in mind. It had a small second room he'd used for storage, separate from the main living area with its stone fireplace and his bed. I cleared the storage room, he said carefully. Put a bed in there I thought you might want, that is, until we know each other better. Genevieve's cheeks colored, but her voice remained steady. That's considerate of you. Thank you. Later, lying in his familiar bed while his wife slept in the next room, Yates stared at the ceiling beams and considered the strange turn his life had taken. He'd sought a practical arrangement, a partnership based on mutual need and respect. What he'd found was a woman whose mind intrigued him, whose strength matched the frontier's demands, and whose presence somehow made his carefully constructed life feel more substantial. Not love, he told himself firmly, but perhaps something with the potential to grow into more than mere survival. Summer passed in a rhythm of shared work and gradual adjustment. Genevieve proved her worth daily, keeping meticulous records of the ranch's finances, expanding the garden with hardy vegetables, even learning to milk the cow and handle a rifle with surprising aptitude. They developed a routine that respected each other's privacy while building a functional partnership. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boundaries between them softened. Conversations over dinner stretched longer into the evening. Genevieve's laugh, rare at first, became more frequent. Yates found himself sharing stories of his early years on the ranch, hardships he'd never before voiced aloud. In August, disaster struck when drought parched the land and lightning sparked a prairie fire that threatened their southern pasture. They worked side by side through the night, digging fire breaks and beating back flames with wet blankets alongside neighboring ranchers who came to help. By dawn, exhausted and smoke-stained, they'd saved the pasture and most of the grazing grass. As they trudged back to the cabin in the pink light of morning, Genevieve stumbled from fatigue. Without thinking, Yates caught her arm to steady her, then found himself drawing her against his side, supporting her weight. Thank you, she murmured, leaning into him momentarily before straightening. For teaching me what to do, we might have lost everything. We saved it together, he corrected, surprising himself with the inclusiveness of his words. When had the ranch become theirs rather than his? September brought the cattle drive to the railroad at Cheyenne, the year's most profitable and dangerous undertaking. Yates hesitated to leave Genevieve alone for the 2 weeks the drive would require, but she dismissed his concerns with practical assurances. Mrs. Wilson will check on me every other day, she reminded him. I can handle the garden and milking, and I have the rifle. Still, the night before his departure, Yates found himself lingering at the table after dinner, watching Genevieve mend one of his shirts by lamplight. If anything happens, he began. She looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Nothing will happen, Yates. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the intimacy of it caught him off guard. Genevieve, he said carefully, testing her name on his tongue. She smiled, a genuine warmth that reached her eyes. There, that wasn't so difficult, was it? No, he admitted, it wasn't. The cattle drive proved successful, bringing a substantial payment that Genevieve carefully recorded in her ledger upon Yates' return. As winter approached, they worked together to prepare the ranch, storing preserves from the garden, repairing the barn roof, ensuring adequate hay for the cattle during the snowbound months ahead. The first heavy snow came in November, earlier than usual, transforming the landscape overnight into a white vastness broken only by the dark shapes of cabin, barn, and distant trees. Yates rose before dawn to check the stock and returned to find Genevieve at the stove, the cabin warm and filled with the smell of coffee and biscuits. It's beautiful, she said, nodding toward the window and the pristine expanse beyond. Dangerous but beautiful. Yates stamped snow from his boots, like most worthwhile things in the territory. Their eyes met across the room, and something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how far they'd come since that first meeting at the train station. The practical partnership they'd built had grown into something neither had anticipated, genuine respect, deepening affection, and a sense of belonging that transcended their original arrangement. That evening, as wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, they sat before the fire reading, Yates with a newspaper from Cheyenne, Genevieve with one of her books on agriculture. The domesticity of the scene struck him suddenly, how natural it felt to share this space, this life with her. I've been thinking, he said, setting aside his paper, about expanding the cabin come spring. She looked up, firelight catching the gold in her hair. Oh, adding a proper bedroom, maybe a small room for books and accounts, he hesitated. If we're to build a future here, we should plan for growth. Understanding colored her cheeks. A family, you mean? Yates nodded, suddenly uncertain. They had maintained separate sleeping quarters all these months, their marriage a partnership in all ways except the most intimate. Neither had pressed for more, content to let trust and affection build slowly. "Is that something you want?" he asked carefully. "Children, I mean." Genevieve set her book aside, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I do, with you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Yates rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, offering his hand. She took it, allowing him to draw her to her feet until they stood face to face in the firelight. "I didn't believe in more than survival when you arrived," he said quietly. "I thought the frontier left no room for deeper attachments." "And now," she prompted, her eyes searching his, "now I think perhaps I was wrong." He reached up hesitantly to touch her cheek. "You've become essential, Genevieve. Not just your help with the ranch, but your mind, your strength, your presence." Her smile bloomed slowly. "Is that a declaration, Yates Landry?" "It's the truth," he said simply, "whatever we want to call it." She leaned into his touch. "I believe the word is love, though it's not what either of us expected." "Love," he repeated, testing the word that had seemed so impractical, so dangerous on the frontier. Now, with Genevieve's steady presence beside him through seasons of work and worry, it felt like the most practical truth of all. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't the brief, ceremonial touch of their wedding day. It was a promise, an affirmation, a beginning. That winter, as snow isolated their ranch from the outside world for weeks at a time, Yates and Genevieve discovered each other anew. Their separate rooms became one, their partnership deepening into an intimacy neither had dared hope for when they'd made their practical arrangement. By spring thaw, Genevieve's figure had softened with the first signs of the child they'd created together. As they stood on the porch watching winters retreat across their land, Yates wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Not what I ordered," he mused, pressing a kiss to her temple, "but exactly what I needed." Genevieve leaned into him, her hand covering his where it rested protectively over their growing child. "Sometimes the frontier gives you what you need," she agreed, "even when it's not what you thought you wanted." Together they watched the Wyoming sun transform their land from winter white to spring promise, the future stretching before them, not merely survival now, but a life built on partnership that had blossomed against all frontier odds into love.